Hello and welcome to another edition of the Ferncast. This week I'm with Joanne Coates, or Jo Coates as she likes to be called, and she's an artist, but I think it's better if we let her describe where she is and what she does and which medium she uses. Joanne, over to you. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. So, I am an artist who uses primarily photography, but also installation, sound, can be video to kind of tell these complex stories, usually of rural life, of class in the countryside, and to kind of look at issues that those areas might be facing. And I'm right at the top of the Yorkshire Dales National Park, so on the border between the northeast of England and North Yorkshire.
And through your work, how long have you been doing your work?
I graduated in 15 and had studied in London. And I mean, I was already kind of like assisting and doing freelance work while I was studying because I already knew that I wanted to leave London. So I would say, I mean, like professionally, probably since like 2016.
So, with your artwork, you primarily use the medium of photography. From what I can understand, you capture a lot of the lives of people who live in the countryside, predominantly around your area and hopefully the Highlands that you mentioned. Do you see that this type of artwork is well covered generally, or is it something that you find yourself on a limb doing?
I think probably the latter, yes. So while I was studying, I mean, I think it was complicated because as a young person, I felt like I had to leave that area and there wasn't any arts organisations or there wasn't any way of me seeing that I could do this job. So I felt like I had to leave. And also, as a young person, you want to go to a big city. So I kind of left, and then, but the kind of points of reference I was given at university weren't examples of rural practice or like rural projects, rural people. And it was always kind of the more centralised view of rural places and spaces where I didn't really feel seen, or I didn't see like the particular issues that I'm talking about represented. So I think that sometimes you see a kind of idyllic version, that kind of like pastoral green space, beautiful rural Britain, or you see like that more negative, maybe like backwater, but it doesn't talk about the complexities of those issues. And I would say that my work is like probably in the middle of that, or I would say like the anti-idyll is something that I would use to kind of describe it. But sadly, yeah, I don't really see it represented. And I think that that is also maybe like a driving factor of why I want to do it.
So you mentioned the idyll, which is I think it was initially coined by Simon Pemberton down at Keele University a few years ago, and it's become quite synonymous as a phrase that people use to describe the countryside. With your lifestyle there and your life in your area, have you noticed that there's been an influx of people who see your area as a rural idyll rather than a working area?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, yeah, I do actually. I think I always try and work out kind of like when that version of the countryside changed. And I know that like if you look at David Cameron's kind of like election campaign, and he talked of like it was very like pastoral Britain and this kind of like very middle class version of the countryside that was kind of like pasteurized almost, like this kind of very clean version that I found quite strange. And then I think since then I've seen that increasing, and maybe that's because one of the biggest sectors is tourism. So you are selling the countryside as an experience to people, which often means that the idyll is the way of doing that. And I mean, it's the tourism sector is complicated because there's a lot of service jobs, and they actually do kind of support working class people in that way. But I do think when you kind of have this like idyllic version, it maybe like erases the fact that people are working on the land and that working multiple jobs and doing really quite often difficult work. And that's, I guess, what I worry about, is that it doesn't show the complexities of this space, or that there are people who are working these jobs that are pretty tough, really.
So you mentioned that, and you said on your X account on Twitter, as it used to be called, but about your partner, the recent protests in London, the farmers, and he's a farmer, as you said. Do you find that when you're working in your practice, people assume that it's easy and his life is easy and living in a rural area is easy? So, going beyond the whole idle concept, but something more akin to, people don't take it seriously enough as a vocation, I suppose.
Yeah, I do think there is that. I mean, I know I can accept that it's a very beautiful place, and like, I mean, the Yorkshire Dales particularly are incredibly beautiful. So if you're driving
That is
through or
true,
if
yeah.
you're visiting, you can just like look at it and be like, that must be heaven to work there. Do people really have to work that hard? But I mean, it is incredibly complex. And I mean, my partner Dan, he's very shy. He doesn't have any social media himself, and he's very like a lot of people in the countryside, quite humble and would never say how much he's working. But like in summer, there's that kind of like that joke around you're like a contractor's widow because they are working from 6 a.m. till 11 p.m. You don't see them at all really in the summer. And then in wintertime you have calving. So what kind of happens is, yeah, a lot of people will work on a farm, but they'll also, if say if it's a small family farm, they'll usually have jobs contracting, or they'll be doing jobs like with different farmers around the Dale, or they might have a off-farm job. So you might have someone who's an accountant and a farmer, or you might have someone who's working in the shop and is a farmer, or you might have people like myself who there's work that I do on the farm, which is kind of like just helping out in terms of like family informal support network, but also doing relief milking, which is for a different farm, so a different family. And then also have a job that's kind of completely outside of that sector. And all with that, I think you have to look at the additional transport that people have to do, the kind of additional hours to get to places, the kind of difficulties. And I think what people maybe don't take into consideration is like, if I speak about my partner Dan, he doesn't have a lunch break. He doesn't have, and as a contractor, sometimes you're waiting on getting paid for a long time. And there are kind of issues around it that, you don't have sick pay, you don't have holiday pay.
Yeah, there's no pension plans or anything like that. Yeah.
No, and I mean, like, I have been quite surprised to see people not realizing that how challenging that can be, and that a lot of people doing that job aren't wealthy.
So you mentioned in your tweets about Dan's dad. Unfortunately, he has dementia. How's that been? How's that affected life for you guys? Because it must be hard, surely.
I mean, I think it's really challenging if you look at someone who knows the land so well, like they know it in this really deep, ingrained way, to then forget a field name is quite upsetting for them personally, but also for you to, that they know that information in a way that is very like, to the core. It's not just forgetting a road name, it's the land that you will have worked and like will have this incredible bond to. And I think just even working as a family farm, it brings an additional pressure, because how long can that person work on their own for? Like, what else do they need?
Is he still active then?
He's still active, yeah.
That's fantastic. But, that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, one of the issues we often talk about, and, with your artwork, I think you capture it really quite well, is the level of stress that people have to live with in the countryside, which might not be apparent. I mean, you've been up in the Highlands, you mentioned, there was a tweet I saw the other day about a person saying, well, it's only 2.5 hours for me to drive from Wick to, I think it was Ullapool, for a meeting or for an appointment to a doctor's. And, rurality in that sense, I don't think people really understand the levels, the cost, the extra burden people have to put up with in those communities. And I think when it comes to like mental health and stuff like that, I think it's very well hidden in the wider context. Do you think so?
I think it's really well hidden. And I mean, mental health in terms of rural areas, it's really hard to access as well because say you get an appointment, and like you said, for those issues of how far away things are, if you are lucky enough to get an NHS appointment or maybe like a series of appointments or help in any way, when are you going to be able to do that? Because a lot of the people that I know are juggling different jobs, or they might be mums, so like they would also have additional childcare responsibilities. When are they going to be able to access that service, and how is a key issue? And I do think that a lot of the issues is maybe that like a lot of rural policies, or when we're thinking of like how do people access these services, we're not thinking of rural areas, so we're not necessarily programming for that. And I think in the Highlands is particularly bad when people are having to go. Where I was is in Helmsdale, which is right up in the northeast, and people have to go all the way to Inverness, so that's like an hour and 40 minutes, for them to get to the hospital. But if they're ill, they might not be able to drive, and even if like if you're going for I don't know cataracts operation or like are you going to be able to use your eyes, so how are you going to get there and how are you going to get back, and the transport doesn't align to when appointments are. And you know it's Helmsdale's a good example because it used to have a maternity ward, so people were telling me how this maternity ward was built and it meant that they could give birth and all the women were really well looked after. But now that's gone, a lot of the young women don't want to live there anymore because there's people who've had to give birth on the side of the road in the dark, and that's
Gosh.
like that's not what you want to do, I don't think.
No, no, it's not ideal, is it? Do you think, I mean, you've now worked in two different spots around the country in the north and the far north. Do you think that it's getting easier for people in these locations? I mean, is it getting harder? Is the demographic challenge, the aging of society, is that making much of a difference, do you think?
There's some, I mean, with rural areas, there are so many different ones. Like, Cornwall is very different to the Dales.
Yeah.
Or even like I've worked up in Orkney. Orkney again is quite different to the Highlands. And the work I did with Orkney was with a young woman called Ashling. And I think what she said was quite interesting because when she was seen as remote, she lives on Hoy, which is an island off the main island of Orkney. And she was saying, well, actually, it's not that bad if I need to get to the hospital because there is like an emergency boat that takes you. So that actually doesn't always take so long. But then you have to contend with the weather and conditions. But what was really impacting her was the fact that I'd there's a really great book called Rural Poverty Today, and they talk about it's this kind of like social isolation. So there's only two people under 35 on that side of Hoy, that side of the island. It's like Ashley really wants to stay there, but there's no spaces, so there's no pubs, there's no, especially in winter, no cafes, nowhere to go. There's no, like where are her networks, and it's this kind of like social exclusion from being able to like live as a citizen, a rural citizen, and that's made not possible through what is happening in certain communities. And it is incredibly hard for those people to want to stay. So I do think yes, there's an aging population, but there are people who want to stay in their communities and who have brilliant ideas. Like Ashlyn is the Carbon Neutral Islands officer. She's one of the most intelligent people, well spoken. She's on the different committees and councils. She's the exact type of person that would renew and bring energy to a community, but she can't live there. And I think that there's something about that that's really sad.
And so, with your work so far, what do you think has been the driving force with the messages and stuff that you're sending out with it?
I mean, I think for people to understand, there is still this kind of thought that maybe poverty doesn't exist in the countryside, or these kind of issues don't exist. But if you kind of like look at the graphs of urban poverty and rural poverty, yes, urban poverty is higher, on those kind of graphs, but actually not by much. So you're talking about 5%, and the trends that they follow are the same. So the kind of trends across the country. And I think the driving force is to get people to. I mean, I'm very aware that the arts in itself cannot bring about complete social change.
No, but it raises the point, though, doesn't it?
I mean, I hope so.
It
That is,
makes you. That's the whole point of art. It makes you ask questions. You have to think.
ask questions, and then ideally, it would be amazing if it could influence policy.
I mean, you raised an interesting point this week. My daughter, and I just put it on blue sky. But this week, my daughter was able to get invited down to Westminster for a tour of the school of the Parliament, and it was really interesting because she is, one of a few kids who are going down there, and I think access to rural lifestyle. Oh, one sec, to pause here. Yeah, so this week my daughter went down, is being invited down to Westminster to go and see Parliament. And what's really interesting is the fact that how many kids from local areas actually manage to do that and actually to see London. And there's always been the debate that a child in the west of Cumbria is more deprived than a child from central London who's in deprivation because of access to being near the centre of power and culture and history and all access. As you know, you've studied in that area and you've lived in London, so all of a sudden you see how much they take for granted access to things that we are, impressed about. Do you think that's been a bit of an issue that you've seen?
I mean, definitely. And even there was, so when I graduated, I said, all my work is about rural places. London was too expensive for me to stay living in. I'm going to move back home. And one of my lecturers said to me, you will never make it because you need to be in London to have the connections. So even if you work just as hard, you won't be able to have the kind of, you need to meet photo editors, arts organisations, different, and you won't have that where you are. Now that is true, but I'm also very strong-willed. So I think you can do it. And I think actually increasingly, so I've set up, at the moment it's like a strand of my practice, arts practice, but I want it to kind of be something maybe like a kick along the line. So it's called Ruva Arts, and one of the things that I do with that is like we have these arts meetups for different artists, because one of the issues is that as a rural person you can't access arts organisation, networking, meeting together, talking about what you're going to do, and just that is incredibly important in any sector. And so I set that up on the farm, and we had like 10 people meeting, eating together, talking about like what barriers do you face as an artist, like what is potentially an issue for you, and we kind of came up with this like tree of dreams and turning those issues into like what would actually help with that. So that's one of the things we do, but then also bringing the community in and together. But a different thing is there's also kind of like this isolation, like rural isolation or lack of togetherness, and so kind of bringing things like dancing, meal sharing, events again on the farm, bringing people together. Now I guess I mentioned that because you can try and bring those things to where you are, but I do think that one of the issues is the UK especially is one of the most centralised in the whole of Europe, and it focuses on whether that's...
And it's only getting worse, isn't it?
Yeah, and only getting worse. And I mean, even if you look at like journalism or like different sectors, so it's kind of like Cardiff, London, Edinburgh, and that there's different issues in all those spaces. And I do think if you look at some other places, there are real kind of exciting things happening. Like I've got a grant to go to Japan in April, and I'm going to go to Arts Atuchi, and what they do is it's an arts festival, but they value the rural areas. And so yes, it's about like tourism and it's about kind of driving change, but it's also about climate, and it's also about respecting what is there and farming. And so there's all of that is happening. And also artists in Japan, it's very different to here. They're kind of seen as rural artists, are seen as important. And I do think there's something around that, and I think it's interesting when you mention like your daughter getting to go, because a lot of people, like you said in Cumbria, they won't ever get to go. And not even just to London, to Manchester, or there's incredible barriers to that for them.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, doesn't it? I mean, how much, and this is obviously worth a PhD for someone, but how much does culture matter, especially with upbringing? I grew up in a rural area, you've grown up in a rural area. We can pinpoint the issue that, we have been deprived a certain amount of access to stuff. And, that's been to the detriment presumably of your career and stuff like that, because as like your lecturer said, if you're not here, you're nowhere. And so, do you think there are ways that long term these trends can be reversed, or do you think it's a one way traffic?
I hope it's not a one-way traffic. I mean, I really hope it's not. I mean, it's complicated. I mean, there's some incredible people out there doing work on this and kind of looking at that who are probably better placed than me in terms of like what to actually do. But I do have a hope that it can be different. And that's why I'm kind of doing stuff like Ruva Arts, or why I do my arts practice. And it's why when I'm thinking about like where to show work, so if I'm going to show my work in an art gallery, even in Middlesbrough, I'll also show it in a different way in a field that's maybe used as the show field and where the pub is for the people in that community who travelling would be too difficult for. So it's kind of tailoring. And I know that people might be like, that's really art specific, but what I'm saying with that is you can tailor what you're doing for the place that you're doing it in so that everyone has equal access and opportunity to access different things. And I don't think it has to cost lots and lots of money.
No, it doesn't. And I suppose there's been the definition of high culture and low culture and stuff like that, and are rural areas worthy of high culture in the sense that well, it's like you say, you mentioned Middlesbrough, and I've lived there before, and I was there when they built Mima, and it was a great move by that town. Or when they put the Anish Kapoor sculpture by the docks, I mean, it's still there if people want to go and have a look, and it's really interesting because you could see a northeast town, try and push itself out of the corner it was in, and a lot of people poo-pooed that idea there and said, the so-called addition of culture doesn't always pan out, and what did they call it? The Bilbao effect. So you stick an art gallery somewhere, and they will come. Philosophy doesn't always pan as a theory. I think with that, people extend that to rurality at the same time and say, well, nobody's going to come. It's too far away from access. There's no railways, and you got to drive there, so nobody can. But then you have things like the Yorkshire Sculpture Park, which have been roaring successes. Or not far from you, you've got not specifically cultural, but more of an entertaining thing. You've got the Secret Garden, was it near Wensleydale? I think it was.
Forbidden Corner.
Forbidden Corner, that's the one. So that one was always, really interesting, and someone built that themselves, and and as a way to attract people there. Granted, it is tourism based, but at the same time, it was something homegrown from that area. So, do you think that potentially big scale cultural projects could be the way forward, akin to the Yorkshire Sculpture Park and stuff like that?
I mean, I think they could. I mean, and I definitely think hopefully I will learn more when I go to Japan. I might say something different after I've done, because the grant is to kind of research what that festival is doing. But if you look at that, as long as it works with the people that are there, so if you're kind of thinking they work, so they do like farm tours and stuff, so that farmers can have increased revenue, and so that benefits. And they say when you get on an island, please don't bring a car. And that's different because obviously it's a small island that you can walk around, but please don't add to the traffic of the local place. And I think as long as you're planning with people, so consulting the community, which can be really difficult, but I think is vital. And I mean, like when you do like any kind of arts project, like the one that I've just done, I'll say, look, this is what I want to do, and I really want to work with a group of women. And the community said, actually, do you know what? Our issue is that we don't have childcare, so we wouldn't be able to attend anything. So actually, it would suit us better if you would work with the young people. And I'm like, that's fine. I will adapt and be flexible and change the project. And I think that as long as there's that kind of thinking, and especially with cultural projects, I think can be incredible. And there's somewhere called Grisdale Arts in Cumbria, and they set up the Farmers Arms, and the Farmers Arms is an incredible example of working with the community. And there's stories around how that's founded that are really interesting as well.
Yeah, there's a few places like that, and there was the culture and the can't remember which one it was now, but the Forestry Commission did a walkway through one of the forests up there, to make it like the Gruffalo. So it was a great day out for kids and stuff like that. So yeah, I suppose you could say there are examples of it. So where do you think it's going to go in the next few years with your work? Which direction do you think you got Japan on the cards, and so then where after that?
Well, I'd really like to keep doing stuff with Ruva Arts and kind of thinking of how that is. Obviously, it's a bit it's very socially engaged arts, which is where you're kind of bringing people together. But I think like bringing farmers research, rural people together to like make work and to kind of think about how can that be something that diversifies the farm income, but also is actually providing support. And I think especially for like rural working class people, how can that be a space that like encourages and supports them? So that's like one thing that I really want to focus on. But also I'm carrying on making work about women and agriculture, so like gender and succession, in North Yorkshire and Cumbria. So that's something that I'm really excited about. And then I've been working as the election artist, which was when the election was on. And what I chose was, I didn't know whether they would go for it because I kind of said what I think is important or is going to be a real key issue is the rural vote, and places that are seen as decentralised. So I'm going to be working on the final outcome for that, and that hopefully will be on display like end of next year or early 2026, which seems a long way away. But I'm hoping like within that to really, yeah, say like these places matter, these people matter, and they have huge potential.
Brilliant. Jo, how can people reach out to you? What socials are you on?
So on Instagram, I'm Joanne Coates, which is Coates, because no one can ever understand my O's. And on X or Twitter is Joanne R. Coates. Then I think Instagram's the main one that I use. And I'm always up for kind of chats with people to talk about these things. And then, yeah, just send me an email.
Cool. Are you on Blue Sky as well?
I think I made one, but I don't have the app on my phone.
You're not on there yet. Okay, cool. Right. Well, Jo, thanks for joining us today. And it's been really interesting to hear about your artwork and the wider issues of the Rural Society.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks now.